The full moon cast its pale light over a dense forest, its beams struggling to pierce through the thick canopy of leaves. Shadows danced between the towering trees as a chilling wind rustled the branches. Deep within the woods, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant rustle of unseen creatures. Among the trees, a small figure moved hesitantly, a young girl named Ella, no older than 6, her wide eyes reflecting both fear and determination. She had wandered into the forest earlier that evening, chasing after a butterfly that had caught her eye during a family picnic near its edge. As the daylight faded, she realized too late how far she had strayed. Now, the once inviting forest loomed over her like a dark labyrinth. Ella clutched her small backpack tightly, its weight a faint comfort against the growing fear in her chest. Inside were a few snacks her mother had packed, along with a small flashlight that had become her lifeline in the encroaching darkness. She clicked it on and off nervously, the beam of light barely cutting through the thick shadows. At the same time, a large wolf prowled silently among the underbrush. Its dark fur blended seamlessly with the night, and its golden eyes glinted with intelligence. This was no ordinary wolf. It moved with purpose, its ears swiveling to pick up even the faintest sounds. It had been drawn by Ella's cries earlier in the evening, following her scent as it weaved through the forest. Unaware of the wolf's presence, Ella stumbled over a root, her small hands catching her fall just in time. Tears welled in her eyes, but she bit her lip, determined not to cry. "I have to find Mommy and Daddy," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The wolf paused, its sharp ears catching her words. Slowly, it approached, its movements calculated and deliberate. It emerged from the shadows just as Ella stood, its imposing form illuminated by the weak beam of her flashlight. Ella froze, her breath hitching as her eyes met the wolf's. It stood several feet away, its gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart pound. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs refused to move. The wolf's golden eyes seemed to hold her in place, their depth both terrifying and mesmerizing. For a moment, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, the wolf took a step closer, its massive paws crunching softly against the fallen leaves. Ella's flashlight flickered as her hand shook, the small beam illuminating the wolf's face. Its expression was not one of aggression, but something she couldn't quite place. Curiosity, perhaps, or even concern. "But please don't hurt me," Ella whispered, her voice barely audible. The wolf stopped, tilting its head slightly as if trying to understand her words. It lowered itself onto its haunches, its ears twitching. To Ella's astonishment, it didn't growl or bare its teeth. Instead, it seemed to be waiting, its eyes locked on hers. Gathering her courage, Ella took a hesitant step backward, her gaze never leaving the wolf. It remained where it was, watching her with an intensity that made her feel both vulnerable and strangely safe. "You're not going to hurt me, are you?" she asked, her voice a little steadier this time. The wolf let out a low whine, its head lowering slightly. Ella blinked, her fear momentarily replaced by confusion. Why would a wild animal act this way? She had heard stories of wolves being dangerous, but this one didn't seem threatening. If anything, it seemed protective. Before she could think further, a distant voice echoed through the trees. "Ella! Ella, where are you?" It was her mother, her voice tinged with panic. "Mommy!" Ella shouted, her voice cracking as relief flooded through her. She turned toward the direction of the voice, her small feet ready to run. But the wolf reacted first. It sprang to its feet, positioning itself between Ella and the source of the voice. For a moment, she hesitated, her relief replaced by confusion. Was the wolf trying to stop her? Why? The forest around them grew eerily quiet, the tension thick enough to cut. Ella's gaze darted between the wolf and the direction of her mother's voice. Something about the wolf's stance, alert and protective, made her pause. As another call echoed through the woods, Ella took a step forward, her hand gripping the strap of her backpack. The wolf followed, staying close to her side. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but one thing was clear: this wolf wasn't going to leave her alone. Ella's small feet crunched over fallen leaves as she moved toward her mother's voice, the wolf shadowing her every step. Its massive frame stayed close, its ears swiveling at every faint sound in the forest. The flashlight's weak beam wavered as Ella's hands trembled, the tension in the air thick and oppressive. The voice calling for her grew louder, clearer, and Ella's heart leaped with hope. "Mommy, I'm here!" she shouted, her voice breaking the heavy silence. She quickened her pace, her tiny legs carrying her forward with renewed energy. But the wolf's reaction stopped her in her tracks. It stepped in front of her, its large body blocking her path. Its golden eyes locked onto hers, filled with an urgency she couldn't understand. It let out a low growl, not directed at her, but at something unseen in the darkness ahead. Ella's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around, the shadows stretching endlessly in every direction. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The wolf's stance was tense, its body low to the ground as if preparing for something. It turned its head toward the trees, its ears twitching at a faint sound that Ella couldn't hear. Before she could react, a branch snapped in the distance. The sound was sharp and deliberate, sending a shiver down Ella's spine. Her flashlight flickered as her grip tightened around it. She took a step closer to the wolf, her small frame leaning into its warmth. "Ella, where are you?" Her mother's voice echoed again, louder this time, but it was accompanied by something else, a rustling sound that seemed out of place, too heavy to belong to her parents. The wolf let out a low, rumbling growl, its eyes narrowing as it stared into the darkness. Ella followed its gaze, her small fingers clutching the fur on its back for comfort. "Is something out there?" she asked, her voice trembling. The answer came in the form of movement, shadows shifting between the trees, slow and deliberate. Ella squinted, her flashlight casting a weak glow that barely penetrated the gloom. A shape emerged, tall and unsteady, its features obscured by the darkness. She couldn't make out what it was, but the wolf's reaction told her all she needed to know. It bared its teeth, a fierce snarl ripping through the silence. The sound made Ella's knees buckle, but she didn't let go of the wolf. She clung to it, her fear giving way to a strange sense of trust. Whatever was out there, she knew the wolf wouldn't let it harm her. The shadowy figure stopped, its presence looming just beyond the reach of her flashlight. For a moment, the forest was eerily still, the only sound the wolf's steady growl. Ella held her breath, her small chest rising and falling rapidly. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure retreated into the trees. The rustling sound faded, leaving behind only the faint hum of the wind through the leaves. The wolf relaxed slightly, its growl subsiding as it turned to look at Ella. Its golden eyes seemed to reassure her, as if saying, "You're safe now." Ella swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Was that someone bad?" The wolf didn't answer, of course, but its actions spoke volumes. It nudged her gently with its nose, urging her to keep moving. Ella took a shaky step forward, her flashlight flickering as she called out again, "Mommy, I'm coming!" The wolf stayed close, its presence a comforting shield against the fear that gripped her. As they moved through the forest, the sounds of her parents' voices grew louder. Relief washed over Ella as she spotted a faint glow in the distance, the beam of another flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Ella!" her mother cried, rushing forward as soon as she saw her. Her father followed close behind, his face etched with worry. They enveloped her in a tight embrace, their relief palpable. But their joy was short-lived. The wolf stepped into the light, its massive frame drawing gasps from both parents. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "Ella, step back!" she cried, pulling her daughter closer. "No," Ella protested, clinging to the wolf's fur. "It's okay, it's helping me." Her father stepped forward, his expression a mix of fear and confusion. "That's a wild animal, Ella. It's dangerous." Ella shook her head vehemently, tears streaming down her face. "No, it's not. It protected me." The wolf stood still, its eyes calm but watchful. It made no move to approach, as if understanding the parents' fear. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, a gesture that seemed almost respectful. Ella's mother hesitated, her gaze flickering between her daughter and the imposing animal. "Look," Ella whispered, her voice trembling. "It didn't hurt me. It scared away the bad thing." Her father frowned, glancing at the darkness behind them. "Bad thing? What are you talking about?" "There was something in the forest," Ella said, her grip on the wolf tightening. "It was following me, but the wolf chased it away." Her parents exchanged a worried look, their relief replaced by a growing sense of unease. Her father shone his flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing there, only the rustling of leaves in the wind. The wolf let out a soft huff, its golden eyes meeting Ella's one last time before it turned and disappeared into the shadows. Ella's heart sank as she watched it go, her small hand reaching out as if to stop it. "Wait!" she cried. "Don't leave!" But the wolf was gone, its sleek form vanishing into the forest as silently as it had appeared. The forest fell silent once more, the absence of the wolf leaving a void that felt both unsettling and protective. Ella clung tightly to her mother, her small body trembling with a mix of relief and lingering fear. Her father stood nearby, his flashlight scanning the dense trees, searching for any sign of the mysterious figure Ella had mentioned. "What do you mean something was following you?" her father asked, his voice low but steady. His hand tightened around the flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows but revealing nothing out of the ordinary. Ella sniffled, wiping her tear-streaked face with her sleeve. "It was big," she whispered. "It stayed in the dark. I couldn't see its face, but I heard it. The wolf stopped it." Her mother exchanged a worried glance with her father. "Are you sure, sweetie?" "It might have been your imagination," she said gently, though her tone betrayed her own unease. Ella shook her head firmly. "It was real, Mommy. The wolf growled at it, and then it ran away." Her father exhaled sharply, his brow furrowed as he scanned the forest again. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice tense. "We'll talk about this later, but right now we need to get Ella somewhere safe." As they turned to leave, Ella hesitated, her gaze lingering on the spot where the wolf had vanished. A part of her wanted to follow, to thank it for protecting her, but her parents' urgency pulled her back. She allowed herself to be led away, her small hand clutching her mother's tightly. The walk back to the car felt endless, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig making Ella's heart race. Her parents moved quickly, their own fear evident in their hurried steps and darting glances. The forest seemed to close in around them. its shadows deeper and more menacing than before. When they finally emerged from the trees and into the clearing where their car was parked, relief washed over them like a wave. Ella's father unlocked the doors, ushering her and her mother inside before climbing into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and the headlights illuminated the path ahead as they sped away from the forest. Ella sat quietly in the back seat, her gaze fixed on the trees disappearing into the distance. Her parents' voices murmured in the front, but she couldn't focus on their words. Her thoughts were consumed by the wolf, its piercing golden eyes, its unwavering presence, and the way it had stood between her and the unknown danger. "Ella," her mother said softly, turning to look at her. "Are you okay?" Ella nodded slowly, though her mind was far from at ease. "The wolf wasn't bad," she said after a moment, her voice quiet but firm. "It saved me." Her mother hesitated, glancing at her father before responding. "Maybe it did," she said gently. "But it's still wild, Ella. It's not safe to be near animals like that." Ella frowned, her small hands gripping the hem of her jacket. "It didn't hurt me," she insisted. "It was trying to help." Her father sighed, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "We're just glad you're safe," he said. "That's all that matters." The drive home was quiet, the tension in the car thick despite their relief at being out of the forest. When they arrived, her parents tucked Ella into bed, their words soothing but their concern evident. Ella closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the wolf. Hours later, long after her parents had gone to bed, Ella awoke to a faint sound outside her window. She sat up, her heart pounding as she listened intently. The sound came again, a soft rustling, followed by a low, familiar huff. Ella climbed out of bed and crept to the window, her small hands pulling back the curtain. In the moonlight, she saw it, the wolf, standing at the edge of the yard. Its golden eyes met hers, calm and steady, and her fear melted away. It stood there for a moment longer before turning and disappearing into the shadows once more. Ella smiled, a quiet sense of gratitude filling her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. She didn't know why the wolf had stayed, or why it had chosen to protect her, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never forget it. Days turned into weeks, but Ella couldn't stop thinking about the wolf. She replayed the night in the forest over and over in her mind, the way it had appeared out of the shadows, its protective growls, and the unwavering gaze that had given her strength. Her parents had tried to move on, brushing off her insistence that the wolf was more than just an animal. But Ella knew better. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Ella gathered her courage. "Do you think I'll ever see the wolf again?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with hope. Her mother looked at her father, a hesitant smile on her lips. "Sweetie, wolves don't usually stay near people. It probably went back to the forest where it belongs." Ella frowned, her small fingers fiddling with her fork. "But it wasn't like other wolves," she said firmly. "It wasn't mean. It protected me." Her father sighed, setting down his glass. "Ella, sometimes animals act on instinct. Maybe it thought you were part of its pack for a moment, but it's dangerous to think a wild animal could be your friend." Ella opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she nodded, letting the conversation drift to other topics. Still, the thought lingered in her mind. Was the wolf truly gone, or was it still watching over her? That night, Ella lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as moonlight streamed through her window. She felt an ache in her chest, a longing to thank the wolf properly for what it had done. Her gaze drifted to her backpack, sitting by the door, and an idea began to form. The next morning, Ella woke early, sneaking out of the house with her backpack slung over her shoulder. She had packed carefully: a piece of bread, some leftover chicken, and her favorite red scarf. She didn't know why, but she felt like the wolf deserved something special. The forest loomed ahead, its tall trees swaying gently in the breeze. Ella hesitated at the edge, the memory of that dark night sending a shiver down her spine. But she took a deep breath and stepped forward, her small feet crunching over the leaves. As she ventured deeper, the sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the ground. The forest seemed less menacing now, though she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She reached a small clearing and set her backpack down, pulling out the food and the scarf. Carefully, she placed them on a flat rock, arranging them as neatly as her small hands could manage. "For you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for helping me." Ella stepped back, her heart racing as she waited. The minutes stretched on, the silence of the forest broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird. Just as she began to doubt herself, a soft rustling reached her ears. She turned, her breath catching as the wolf emerged from the shadows. Its golden eyes met hers, calm and steady, just as they had been that night. It moved cautiously, its large paws silent on the forest floor. Ella stayed still, her small hands clenched at her sides as the wolf approached the rock. It sniffed the food, then looked at her, its head tilting slightly. Ella's heart swelled as it picked up the scarf gently in its jaws, its movements careful and deliberate. It stood there for a moment, the red fabric draped over its muzzle like a symbol of the bond they shared. "Do you remember me?" Ella asked softly, her voice trembling. The wolf let out a soft huff, its golden eyes never leaving hers. It felt like an answer, an acknowledgement of the trust they had built in that moment of fear and uncertainty. Slowly, it turned and disappeared into the forest, the red scarf trailing behind it like a ribbon of hope. Ella stood there for a long time, her heart full. She didn't know when or if she would see the wolf again, but she felt a sense of closure. It wasn't just to protect her, it was a part of her story, a reminder of courage, trust, and the unexpected bonds that could form in the most unlikely of places. When she returned home, her parents were waiting, their relief turning to worry as they realized where she had been. But as Ella told them about the wolf's return, her eyes shining with joy, they couldn't bring themselves to scold her. Instead, they listened, realizing that the experience had left an indelible mark on their daughter. And though the forest remained as mysterious as ever, Ella no longer feared it. She knew that somewhere among the trees, a silent guardian watched over her, its golden eyes a beacon of protection and understanding. Weeks passed, and life returned to its usual rhythm. Ella's parents remained cautious, keeping her close whenever they visited the forest's edge. But Ella wasn't afraid anymore. The fear that had gripped her that night was now replaced with a quiet reverence for the wolf, a guardian she couldn't forget. The story of Ella and the wolf spread through their small town, whispered in homes and shared in conversations over coffee. Some dismissed it as a child's imagination, a fanciful tale of a wild animal showing kindness. But those who saw the conviction in Ella's eyes knew there was truth to her story. The wolf had become a symbol of courage, its mysterious presence sparking wonder and admiration among those who heard about it. One evening, as the family gathered around the fireplace, Ella's father broke the silence. "You've been different lately," he said, his tone gentle. "Braver, I think." Do you feel that way?" Ella looked up from the book in her lap, her small face thoughtful. "The wolf made me brave," she said simply. "It showed me that even when things are scary, you can still do the right thing." Her mother smiled, pulling her into a hug. "You've always been brave, sweetheart," she whispered. "The wolf just reminded you." That night, Ella dreamed of the forest. In her dream, the wolf stood tall and proud, the red scarf still draped over its back. It didn't speak, but its eyes told her everything she needed to know, that it would always be there, watching from the shadows, a silent protector whenever she needed it most. The next day, Ella asked her parents if they could visit the forest again. Reluctantly, they agreed, staying close as she wandered to the clearing where she had left the food and scarf. The rock was bare now, but Ella felt a sense of peace as she stood there, imagining the wolf moving gracefully through the trees. As they walked back to the car, her father paused, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You know," he said, "that wolf might not be just an ordinary animal. Maybe it found you for a reason." Ella smiled, her eyes shining with the certainty of a child's unshakable belief. "I think it did," she said, "and I'll never forget it." The wolf's impact on Ella's life went beyond that single night. It had taught her lessons that words couldn't convey, about trust, resilience, and the unexpected ways help could come when you needed it most. Though the forest remained vast and mysterious, Ella no longer saw it as a place of fear. Instead, it was a place of possibility, where even the darkest shadows could hold a light. As they drove away from the forest, Ella turned to look out the window, her eyes scanning the trees one last time. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a flash of red, a scarf trailing behind a familiar figure. Her heart swelled, and she pressed her hand to the glass, a quiet goodbye whispered under her breath. From that day forward, Ella carried the wolf's lesson with her. In moments of doubt or fear, she remembered its unwavering presence, the way it had stood by her side when she needed it most. And though she never saw the wolf again, she felt its influence in every brave step she took. If this story of courage, trust, and an unforgettable bond touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's celebrate the incredible connections between humans and animals, and the lessons they teach us about resilience and kindness.